Hello and welcome to ITIF's webinar, Rejuvenating Global Energy Innovation to Deliver on Glasgow. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of ITIF's Center for Clean Energy Innovation. For those of you who aren't familiar with ITIF, it's a think tank based in the United States that focuses on science and technology policy, and I lead the Center for Clean Energy Innovation. We've got a great set of speakers lined up for you today, and we should have some time at the end for you to ask questions, and we'll respond. So if you have a question as we go through the lineup, please click on the Slido link below the viewing panel and pop them in there. Julie Cerqueira from the U.S. Department of Energy will kick off our program in just a moment. We'll then turn to a new report written by Hoyu Chong, my teammate here at ITIF. She'll be followed by Nick Johnstone of the International Energy Agency, and Anthony Dorsey of the Cleantech group is the final speaker. And then we'll wrap up with moderated discussion and Q&A. So let me begin by welcoming Julie Cerqueira to the ITIF stage. Julie serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Department of Energy for International Affairs. Prior to joining the Biden administration, she served as the Executive Director of the U.S. Climate Alliance, advancing state climate policy with a group of governors. She served in the State Department in the Obama administration as well. And further details on her background can be found in the bio on the ITIF website. And with no more ado, let me welcome Julie and say thank you for joining us today.
Great. Good morning, David, and thank you so much to you and to folks at ITIF for extending to me the invitation to speak with you all this morning. Connecting on public policy to technological innovation will be one of the core tasks of the clean energy transition. So I'm especially pleased that ITIF has taken on the task of facilitating the conversation that we're going to have here today. We have just entered a new year, and it could not be a more exciting time for energy innovation. Secretary Granholm, who is our secretary at the Department of Energy, has dubbed 2022 as the year of implementation. And so in the spirit of the year of implementation, we're encouraging every nation to go big on clean energy investments. And the Biden administration could not be more serious about doing our part. Last year alone, DOE has already invested over $2.4 billion in clean energy research, development, demonstration, and deployment. And we're putting the weight of our national labs and applied energy programs behind climate solutions. Our Loan Programs Office is also back in business with over $40 billion in loan authority for big deployment projects. But all of these efforts pale in comparison to the nearly $800 billion that Congress is investing in climate action and clean energy. This is the largest in American history. And through the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Biden administration is making a once-in-a-generation investment in our clean energy infrastructure. $21.5 billion for clean energy demonstrations and research hubs, $7 billion for battery supply chain upgrades, $3 billion for smart grid investment matching, and $11 billion for infrastructure hardening. That's just a few of the examples of the resources that we're putting into action to reshape the energy landscape. All of this investment is going to mean strong reductions in emissions, but that's not the only thing. We really see climate leadership and these types of investments as a way for us to facilitate economic prosperity here at home, but then also in our partner countries overseas. And that's because those resources are going towards increasing energy innovation and then creating an estimated average of 1.5 million new jobs here in the United States every year for the next decade. The Biden administration is committed to getting the United States on a path to cut our carbon pollution by more than half by 2030, reach 100% clean power by 2035, and achieve a net zero economy by 2050. And while we already have many of the technologies we need to get there, including things like cost competitive solar and wind, we're really still missing critical pieces of the puzzle. And so that brings me to the next point that I'd like to talk about, which is our focus on innovation. So this year's IEA analysis found that only 6 out of the 46 clean energy technologies are cheap enough to actually get us on track to meet our Paris climate goals. That means that we have to lower the cost for the remaining 40 technologies. And so that has been a big focus for DOE in the previous year, but over the next few years, and why we've designed some of our programs in the way that we have. So while it's essential that we begin the immediate deployment of clean energy technologies available to us, it's equally important that we continue to innovate upon these technologies if we're really going to be able to meet our climate commitments. And that's why DOE launched an audacious set of new programs to find innovative solutions to the challenges posed by clean energy technologies. So following in the tradition of the Kennedy administration's moonshot and the Obama administration's sunshot, we have dubbed these new climate innovation initiatives the Energy Earth Shots. In June, we announced our hydrogen shot, which aims to slash the cost of clean hydrogen by 80%. And that means $1 per 1 kilo in just 1 decade. And this would make it possible for things like long-haul trucks and steel plants to actually run on clean power and not produce any carbon pollution. So the purpose of our Energy Earth Shots are really about dramatically cutting the costs for these remaining linchpin technologies, which is what we need if we're going to get to a net zero world. Just another example of our Energy Earth Shots is on long duration storage, and that aims to cut the cost of energy storage systems lasting over 10 hours by 90%. It's going to help make sure that our 100% clean grids of the future deliver reliable, affordable electricity around the clock. In November, we announced our carbon negative shot, which aims to achieve durable and scalable carbon dioxide removal at less than $100 per net ton. This will help us to achieve not only emissions reductions, but negative emissions reductions. We know that the actions that we're taking today are not going to be enough. And so we really need to find creative solutions to actually pull that remaining carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, especially for these hard to abate sectors. And we're planning to announce additional Energy Earth Shots over the next year. Each one of these innovative initiatives is going to assist in the creation of a network of broad and diverse clean energy technologies to be leveraged going into the future. With our Energy Earth Shots, DOE intends to remain at the forefront of clean energy innovation and deployment. However, we cannot achieve the goal of reaching a net zero future alone. We must work with our partners across the globe to continue raising our climate ambition. So that leads me to one of our new programs called the Net Zero World Initiative. And we're expanding this vision to be more collaborative through 2 of these major announcements. So for Net Zero World, this is going to be bringing together the Department of Energy, State Department, USTDA, Treasury, Commerce, and then philanthropies. The initiative is the department's signature contribution to President Biden's Build Back Better World program. The Net Zero World Initiative will harness the power and the technical expertise of our world-class national laboratories, and that's 17 of them across the country, in order to really drive energy sector decarbonization around the world. And we're going to be doing that by helping our partner countries develop and implement technological roadmaps, as well as investment strategies that are going to tackle not only the power sector, but some of the hard to abate sectors like industry and transportation. There are 6 countries who have already joined us in this effort. And so that is Argentina, Chile, Egypt, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Ukraine. And we're hoping as the program expands that we'll be able to bring in other partners into the fold. The second major international initiative that we had announced at COP26 was that Secretary Granholm has made the United States the next host of the September 2022 Clean Energy Ministerial and Mission Innovation Ministerial meetings, which is going to be held in Pittsburgh jointly. So I'll refer to those as SEMMI. This gathering of international leaders highlights the importance of innovation to deployment, the importance of the innovation to deployment continuum. And so making sure that we're really looking at not only how we're going to be innovating these technologies, but the types of policies and investments that need to be put in place in order for us to make sure that we're keeping commercial deployment sort of on the horizon and something that is within reach. This is going to dovetail very nicely with our domestic agenda because it's going to focus on the linchpin technologies that are really needed to achieve a net zero world. So just to conclude, we stand at a moment of great potential for innovation and the deployment of new technology at unprecedented speed and at unprecedented scale. Potential for partnership across all nations, sectors, and organizations. And if we seize the opportunities before us, I think a net zero future can be well within our reach. So thank you again for hosting this conversation and for the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Thanks, Julie. I can speak on behalf of ITIF and many of our allies and partners in the US and around the world that we're very excited to see innovation take such a prominent place in the administration's agenda, and really appreciate that spirit was brought to Glasgow. I wonder if I might ask you to elaborate a little bit on the net zero world strategy and how you envision the partners, how are partners selected? Are there objectives in terms of numbers of countries or scope to be brought in? Just a little bit of a look ahead with that initiative.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And this is one of my favorite programs. Was, like I said, recently launched at COP26. And our secretary, as well as Secretary Kerry over at the State Department, have just been like huge champions of getting it off the ground. I think in terms of the country selection process, we haven't asked countries to themselves commit to getting to net zero by 2050. The idea is that we've really worked with partners who are strategically important. So many of them are major emitters. A lot of them are regional influencers, so they have broad networks. But most importantly, they are truly committed to decarbonizing their energy systems and to want to do that at an accelerated pace. They want to work with our world-class national labs to receive the technical assistance and advice to be able to do that. And so the intent of the program is to really focus on some of these winners, and then to be able to work with them and across our interagency and our partners to identify, as they're trying to decarbonize their energy systems holistically, what are some of the gaps that we together can fill with them to make sure that we're all working in a concerted effort towards these shared goals and outcomes. And I think that's going to help us actually be more successful perhaps than other programs have been in the past. And it's something that is transformational, I think, and very different from some of these previous approaches. I think the final thing that I'll say about it is that our secretary in particular is really interested in seeing results and making sure that we're actually driving progress. And so that's why when we're looking at these tailored strategies, we're not only focused on creating those roadmaps with our partners and supporting them to do that, but then taking that next step and focusing on implementation. So how are we going to get investments into these sectors to get projects off the ground, to be investing and building out infrastructure? That obviously is going to be a critical piece of that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I think as our other speakers come on, we'll have a even more panoramic view. And I hope when we come back to the discussion, we might take up some of the more delicate topics that face the international community around innovation, such as the relationship between the US and China, perhaps, and the trade system, which is increasingly interacting with the climate policy. But we'll save that for later. Let us go ahead and hear what our other speakers have to say. And thank you again, Julie, for joining us. Let me remind viewers that you can pop your questions into the Slido box as you think of them. And hopefully we'll be able to get to many of them at the end of our panel. So let me turn now to the other speakers today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them now so you'll know them when they come up. First, Hoyu Chong, she's going to lead off. Hoyu is a colleague of mine here at ITIF, where she's a senior policy analyst. She joined our team in October, and we're really excited to have her on board. Her new report, which came out on Monday and which she'll share with you today, assesses key indicators about the health of the global energy innovation system. She joined ITIF from Beacon Economics out in Los Angeles and is braving the cold here in Washington, D.C. this winter. Next up will be Nick Johnstone. I followed Nick's work for many years. He's currently the chief statistician at the IEA, a vital job since IEA tells us much of what we think we know about the world energy system. Prior to joining IEA, Nick was with the Directorate of Science, Technology, and Innovation at OECD, another critical intergovernmental organization where he worked with the Committee on Industry, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship. And before that with the Environment Directorate, among other things. And our cleanup hitter, for those of you who are American baseball fans, I can't help you if you're a cricket fan, will be Anthony Dorsey, Research Manager of the Cleantech Group. Cleantech Group, which I'm sure Anthony will describe in more detail, is one of the premier resources for data on clean energy innovation and entrepreneurship. And they were generous enough to allow us to use some of their data in our global assessment work, including the Global Energy Innovation Index, which we put out in October. As his title suggests, Anthony manages Cleantech Group's research team. He has a background in China, where he spent a number of years prior to joining the Cleantech Group. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hoyu, and she'll unmute and talk about her report.
Thanks, David, and thank you, Julie, again for your wonderful opening remarks. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you may be, I want to thank you for joining us today. My name is Hoyu Chong, a Senior Policy Analyst here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I want to take a moment to thank my team here at the Center for Clean Energy Innovation for their support on my research. I also want to thank Chad Smith for providing data support. He's also the lead author of the Global Energy Innovation Index that ITIF had released back in October 2021, which I highly encourage you to check out the index if you haven't already. Finally, I want to thank Kayleen Schreiber for her work on the data visualization. Today, we'll be discussing our recently published report that looked at the health of the global energy innovation system. We are joined by a wonderful panel that will help unpack these issues and consider ways to rejuvenate the global energy innovation system. Next slide. Oh, can you start the presentation? Thank you. So what is the global energy innovation system? It is a systems approach to innovation that stretches across multiple components, as listed here in this slide. It covers the entire energy innovation pipeline from scientific discovery to full-scale adoption. And it includes a broad array of functions that need to be performed for energy innovation to proceed as quickly as possible. And one thing I really want to emphasize is systems thinking, that each component of the system is interdependent on other components in the system. And if one such component fails, the rest of the system also fails. So how's the system doing? In 2 words, not good. Next slide, please. So in this report, 7 indicators are selected to represent the various components of the system shown in the presentation slide. Here, the indicators are ordered chronologically from scientific discovery to market adoption and national policy adoption. For these indicators, data come from a variety of publicly available and private sources. Public research development and demonstration, or RD&D investment, comes from the IEA, the International Energy Agency. Patents and effective carbon rates, or ECRs, come from the OECD. And clean energy technology export data comes from the UN Comtrade database. Venture capital data and company exit data are from the Cleantech Group, while energy consumption data comes from BP. The performance of each indicator relative to 2015, the year of the Paris Agreement, is marked here by in colors like the traffic light system, so you can see the health of very easily. Overall, knowledge generation, development, and diffusion had delivered a mediocre performance. This component corresponds to public RD&D investments and high-value patents, which is defined as patents filed in at least 2 jurisdictions. The entrepreneurial ecosystem, which is indicated by early-stage venture capital investments and successful company exits through either IPO, mergers, or acquisitions, is the only bright spot in the whole system. But unfortunately, the world still has a very long way to go in terms of market and national policies adoption. which are marked by the last three indicators here. Clean energy technology exports, clean energy consumption, and ECRs have all performed terribly. For ECRs, among the OECD and G20 countries, just under 1/5 of all emissions from all economic sectors are priced at or above the EUR 60 benchmark in 2018, the latest year that is available. Next slide, please. And here are the numbers. In this graph, except for ECRs, which I just discussed, all of the other indicators can be compared to the economic and demographic benchmarks presented here on the right-hand side. 2020 is the latest year for which data is available, except for patents, where 2018 is the latest year. First, public RD&D investments rose 29% compared to 2015 after adjusting for inflation and purchasing power parity globally. This exceeds global GDP growth during the same period, which is good. But however, when Mission Innovation launched in 2015, one of its major goals was to double RD&D investments by 2020. And here we can see that globally, the global has fallen far short compared to this benchmark. Meanwhile, clean energy technology patents have gone sideways. And furthermore, clean energy technology exports have grown very modestly, as you can see, but the growth had unfortunately trailed behind a global GDP. Meanwhile, the global population grew 5.6% between 2015 and 2020, and clean energy consumption increased 22% at the same time, which means per capita clean energy consumption has been growing. This is good. But however, global total energy consumption had grown more than that, which means clean energy consumption had not been able to outpace the growth of total energy consumption, which means fossil fuel consumption unfortunately also grew with little signs of abatement in the near future. As mentioned, early stage venture capital investments and company exits are the only indicators that have performed well in the report. Previously, in the 2000s, there was a surge in venture capital investments in Cleantech. This was dubbed Cleantech 1.0, and the surge in recent years has now been dubbed Cleantech 2.0. Next slide, please. But has venture capital investments in Cleantech really made a roaring comeback? Unlike Cleantech 1.0, where the lion's share of VC investments in Cleantech went to renewable energy, this time, transportation has dominated the VC investments in Cleantech, especially in electric drivetrains and autonomous vehicle technologies. Compared to 2015, early-stage venture capital investments rose by almost 20 billion in 2020, but 18.7 billion of that surge have funneled into transportation technologies, which means the surge in investments in all other clean tech verticals listed here at the bottom of this slide had increased just $1 billion collectively. Recently, we have seen EV companies such as Lucid and Rivian going public and immediately attain higher valuations than many legacy automobile manufacturers such as Ford. This is despite these two companies not having completely matured and commercialized products in the market. Overall, these observations may suggest a frothy market, and we could be looking at a potential bust should the EV market consolidates. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, overall, these indicators suggest a global lack of urgency. However, it is not all doom and gloom. Last year, in 2021, it did yield an array of very exciting and new initiatives that specifically target economic sectors and subsectors where emissions are traditionally hard to abate. Some of these notable new initiatives are listed here in this slide. These new initiatives are very promising, but have so far lacked the support that they need to succeed. Even with the adoption of electric vehicles, which had an absolutely banner year in 2021, it's still fairly early in the transition globally. Nevertheless, the EV transition is a success story. But now, that success must be emulated across a wide range of other technologies. Together, the world must mobilize public sector funding and private sector finance in order to accelerate innovation and to deliver the promises made at Glasgow. From solar energy to electric vehicles, jump-starting energy innovation can be done, but it can also be complex and challenging. Our panelists, Nick and Anthony, who will be presenting after me, can provide deeper insights. Next slide, please. And with that, I just want to wrap up and encourage everyone to check out the report that was released this Monday, as well as the accompanying data visualization. And now I will send it back to David and our panelists for their remarks, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Next slide, please. Here's my contact info. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hoyu. And let me just reiterate to everyone, we encourage you to have a look at Hoyu's new report, as well as our index from the fall, and to hit us up on Twitter, contact us by email if you have questions or want to learn more about our work. With that, let me welcome Nick Johnstone from IEA. For any energy nerds everywhere, speaking on behalf of Hoyu, myself, and my colleagues at ITIF, and I think lots of others here in DC and around the world, we are extremely grateful and fortunate to have IEA doing the kind of work that it's been doing over the last decade. It's really a tremendous contribution, and we welcome his thoughts on global energy innovation system and where it's heading.
Well, thank you very much, David. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate ITIF on a very interesting report. I read it very closely, and I found it. I learned a great deal. If we could move to the next slide immediately, I'm going to start off by building a straw man. If the only problem in the world was dealing with climate change, and we needed to design a policy that induced innovation, and I'll call it a climate policy that induced innovation, what are some of the principles that we'd have to adhere to? Why do I think this is important? Well, because I grew up in a world where I was always asked by policymakers to discuss the relative merits of market-based instruments versus regulations versus information-based measures and that sort of thing. And in the course of doing that kind of work, I realized, well, there were a lot of bad market-based instruments, and there were a lot of great regulations, and the diversity across everything was such that it was better to think in terms of the basic attributes of the policies rather than the policies of themselves. And I came up with 6 principles with my colleagues. They're rather self-evident, I suppose, some a little less so than others. Ambition. What does it cost not to innovate and not to adopt? I prefer to frame it in that term. We need to make it costly not to do so. Depth. Does it provide incentives across a whole range of possible outcomes? Can we get to Julia's negative emissions? Do we provide incentives to encourage to get all the way there? Or do we provide incentives to a certain point and then leave it there? Flexibility. Does the policy induce search across all possible mitigation outcomes? Innovation is sort of like mushrooms in a rainy forest in the fall. It can come from anywhere. And so you need flexible policies in order to make sure that all of these potential mushrooms can spring to life and ultimately be valuable. And then the fourth one, neutrality. Are all the sources which are behind this global public bad treated equally? Those which should be treated equally. Closely related, are we actually hitting what we really want to hit? Or are we hitting something just next to it? That's important because innovation is a long process. And if we're not hitting exactly what we're seeking to hit through our policy objective, then the danger is that we might go awry over time. And then predictability. And I think that's one of the most important. Investors need to know what the horizon looks like, or if it is to change, that there are good reasons for it to change, and that there's information available which helps them to understand that it is likely to change. We next move to the next slide, please. But now getting a bit away from that, that's just a narrow world where the only problem was climate change, and energy was a bit like making widgets or chewing gum. But it's not like that. In fact, there's a whole policy context which has implications for innovation and clean energy. which most obviously would include, of course, the general innovation policy context. I'm in France. Huge amount of R&D tax credits are available, not necessarily for clean energy, but they have significant implications for clean energy, and the manner in which they are designed is extremely important to see what the outcomes are associated with these measures. Obviously, energy is a funny sector, as I mentioned. It's not like making so many goods and services which are relatively free of many of the complex issues that affect the energy sector. And that means that it would have been regulated anyway, with or without climate change, and is regulated anyway, with or without climate change. That, the manner in which we do so, has very significant implications for innovation. If it discourages entry or discourages exit, issues related to competition policy, that has very significant implications for innovation and clean energy, as it does for other parts of the economy. I won't say a word about financial market regulation because Anthony's coming just after me, and he knows infinitely more than I do about that. Trade and investment policy. Julia was mentioning the importance of cooperation. Well, that means that as we try to gain, as economies, our competitive advantage in different areas, we need to make sure that we do so that is not at the expense of benefiting from an increasingly multipolar global frontier. We need to cooperate. We have a global public bad. It needs to be addressed. It can only be addressed by dealing with it together. And then what I've called ancillary framework policies. They may not seem relevant, but they have very significant implications for firm dynamism and thus innovation and entrepreneurship. Contract enforcement, bankruptcy legislation, age or size contingent regulations. If we move to the next slide, please. So I really like the work that was done on patents. Why would I say that? Well, because it was taken from the OECD, and I spent about 10 years of my life, in fact, trying to develop some of those indicators. So it was the best treatment, in fact, that I've seen of that work, taking advantage of all of the advantages of looking at high quality patents relative to other patents. And so I thought that was a nice piece of work. When I look at this measurement issues in comparison, the measurement issues and comparisons associated with patents, the one thing that strikes me is that it's extraordinarily important to control for the fact that not all patents are the same. And the manner in which ITIF does so in a very, I think, exemplary manner is to be applauded. What do we see in the data? Well, as was noted, we saw a drop-off in 2012, 2013. That caused a great deal of consternation in my community. What was going on? Was this a question of measurement error, or was this real? So we've done a great deal of work working with the EPO since then in order to make sure that it was not measurement error. It wasn't. But we've seen it grow since then, and we hope to see it grow further in the years to come. Perhaps more significantly, what we see is a big drop-off finally in terms of fossil fuel-related patents. And you see that in this document in the somewhat lighter blue bar chart there. If we can move to the next slide, please. Just give some idea of when we disaggregate and look inside the patents a bit more. What you see is some of the traditional, more mature parts of the clean energy space: renewables, nuclear, combustion technologies that have implications for climate change mitigation. They have fallen off. The user sectors, transport, production, buildings, have remained relatively stable in recent years after a period of sustained growth. But where the growth in the most recent years has been in what we call enabling technologies: batteries, smart grids, hydrogen, and CCUS, which can be used across a variety of sectors. That's where the growth has been recently, and I think it's this disaggregation helps us to better understand sort of the heterogeneity of performance in recent years. If we move to the next slide, please. Second big question, and one that was, of course, was just raised in the context of venture capital financing as well as successful exit, is the question of entrepreneurship. In this slide, I just want to draw your attention to the line graph and not to the bar chart, the bars component of the graph. This shows, based on data that we have on a population of startups globally, that goes beyond clean energy, beyond energy, to the entire population of startups. Why do we think that's important? Because it's interesting to look at what is happening to green energy startups, but it's interesting to see that component of which might be said to be specific to clean energy relative to what's happening in the firm dynamics context more generally. And here, unfortunately, the picture is not as rosy as any of us would like to see, insofar as we see relatively stable rates of energy-related startups, not clean energy, I have to say, but most of the startups in the energy space are in the clean energy space, relatively stable percentage relative to the growth in startups more generally. And so we can say that things are looking good, and we do see growth. The fall off is just a function of the fact that there's a lag in the data for the most recent years, to emphasize that point. But it is not growing any faster than one sees in startup rates in the economies more generally. Next slide, please. But we do see changes in the focus, their business focus. And the big thing that you see here, and a point that's already been alluded to that I'd like to draw attention to, is as we saw in terms of the amount of financing, in terms of the number of startups, there's been huge growth in the electric vehicle space. That is the lighter green part of the bars. At the same time, energy efficiency and energy management have also grown, where some of the others have fallen in recent years. But this is a very rapid growth in the electric vehicle space. And of course, the growth in financing, because they are generally getting more financing per successful deal than in many other parts of the energy space, is even greater. If we go to the next slide. What else do we see? Well, because we have some rich data in terms of comparing the business strategies of different startups, one thing that we thought was interesting was to look at the percentage of the new startups that could be said to have a digital strategy in the energy space. And here we see rapid and sustained growth over the course of the last 2 decades, from about 25% of energy startups having a digital element to their business strategy to almost 50% in the most recent years. That to me is quite telling, and it relates to the point that I had made previously about the growth in patents related to enabling technologies. Increasingly, digital and energy are merging. If we could go to the next slide, please. Final slide before I conclude. This is the share of early stage energy-related early stage financing in total early stage financing. And a bit like I said with respect to startups, you don't see a significant growth relative to that which is happening in ESF markets more generally. But I do have to emphasize that this data is very preliminary in nature, and I very much look forward to chatting with Anthony about this in due course. If we could go to the next slide, and I believe that's concluding remarks. Yes. Evaluation, 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 the real estate agent mantra. This needs, as we introduce all of these new policies, we need to evaluate them, but not at the expense of action. We need to evaluate ex post in order to get where we need to be in the most efficient manner. As Julia mentioned in reference to the IEA report, we're nowhere near where we need to be. 6 out of 46 of the technologies are off track that we identify as being fundamental. We need to do a lot of work. We need to collect the data, both on the ins and the outs, those that benefit and those that do not benefit from existing policies, and both in terms of firms before and after the implementation of such policies, in order to make sure that we learn from our policy interventions. And as the energy system evolves, we need to change the measures that we use in order to track those developments. So I've put classification, classification, classification. And then I'll add a 4th bullet: cooperation, cooperation, cooperation. Cooperate internationally, cooperate between governments, private sector, universities, and public research institutes in order to make sure that we all deal with this global public bad in the most efficient way possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. That was a great overview. And it looks like you have a data portal coming. So I'm sure, again, speaking on behalf of Energy Innovation Nerddom, we are all excited to see that. And I just want to reiterate your last point about the challenge of capturing real-time, analysis of this dynamic system. Have an ongoing debate about solar PV. How much stock should be put in corporate measures there? Is it good that the startup rate has gone down? That shows that a dominant design has emerged, and many questions that these data bring up, and the answers are always more complicated than we think. And that perhaps that's a good prelude to Anthony, who's providing in real time to his customers and clients information about the startup and entrepreneurship aspects of the system. So let me kick it to him. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Hart. Thank you to Hoyu, to the ITIF for hosting me here today. My name is Anthony Diorsi. I am Research Manager at the Cleantech Group. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Cleantech Group, we're a cleantech research consulting firm. Been around for about 20 years. We've got a few small teams in San Francisco, London, Boston, where I am, and interspersed throughout Europe. We do take a focus on clean tech beyond energy. So we look also at transport and mobility, agriculture and food. We look at natural resources. We look at materials and chemicals. But for today, we're going to stay a little bit squarely focused on clean tech as defined by energy. And we're going to look at some of the opportunities, but also some of the bottlenecks. And with that, I think we're ready to jump in. So Hoyu gave us a great overview of what happened in the earlier part of the century, what is dubbed Cleantech 1.0, and now this newest wave of investment, public listings, really exciting times. But how do we dig into what's different this time around? There's a few key factors from my perspective. The first is that Cleantech 1.0 had a lot of lessons learned. There was some investor carnage, but it wasn't a total failure. Companies like Tesla, Sunrun, SunPower, Jinko Solar, Vestas, Enernoc, those all came out of Cleantech 1.0, and they did start to acclimate the markets a little bit in a way that today's innovators can capitalize on. So that's probably piece number one. A greater difference from the previous Cleantech rounds is there's a much greater sense of urgency. As Julie alluded to, there's more countries adopting net zero decarbonization standards. Of the 2,000 largest companies in the world, I think it's 700 that have some type of carbon neutrality pledge. Within that 700, 400 have a net zero pledge. So there's just a lot more recognition of the challenges and the urgency. Another piece we see at the innovation level is that the technologies that are enabling connectivity, autonomy, smart manufacturing, they're just cheaper and more ubiquitous today. So if you're an innovator, you can focus on your core IP and start to pull some pretty advanced technologies off the shelf, making it so that you don't have to be fully vertically integrated with every product or service that you release. On the market side, innovators no longer have to fully displace a product category. And what I mean by that is that if you're launching an EV company, you're probably competing mostly against other EV companies. You don't have to push the internal combustion vehicles off the road, but that's not incumbent on you necessarily. Some of your predecessors might have done it. The same goes when we look at distributed energy resources and some of the services that are getting layered on top of those. So you do see some precedent already for the products that innovators are bringing into the market. On the corporate side, corporates were the gatekeepers in the last few clean tech eras. That's just not the case anymore. They are competitive with innovators in many ways, but they are partners. And there's a lot of brainy economic folks in the audience. This was once described to me in the previous era of clean tech as corporates being an oligopsony, being the single owners of demand in the ecosystem. And now you're starting to see some innovators that are able to jump over them, get to the market, get to end users, list on public markets. So there's a lot more motivation for corporates to be partnering, investing in innovation today. With that, we can jump to the next slide. So I've given you the optimistic view. Now it's time to pour some cold water on that. We're not going to hit the meaningful climate change targets without a material reduction in operational emissions from corporates globally. A lot of ESG practices today, they're very inward looking. They're focused on reporting and compliance. It doesn't have that micro to macro connection that really allows a company to think about how their actions are impacting the climate, again, in a material way. And indeed, when we look at a lot of these net zero strategies, heavily reliant on carbon offsets, which essentially does just shift the buck a little bit. We need to see operations decarbonized in order to hit those 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius thresholds that are so critical. Partially underlying this challenge is that the difficult decarbonization markets require so-called deep tech, a lot of hardware, very difficult for traditional investors to get involved in. So that's institutional investors, pension funds, mutual funds, difficult to balance their fiduciary duty with the risk profile of hardware. The same goes for venture capital funds. That 10-year life cycle makes it a much better fit for software, where a relatively small amount of capital can catalyze that explosive growth. And it's just, it's a longer R&D cycle, a lot more CapEx involved with hardware. So there's a pressing need in the market for more patient capital, more alternative financing vehicles. And another piece of this is that us out in the community, ourselves, Cleantech Group, think tanks, media, we need to develop a better common vocabulary to delineate between the types of funds that are going to, in theory, achieve a certain type of decarbonization. When you see the headlines about a lot of climate funds launched in recent years, most of them are focusing on software. You can do a lot of great things with software. It's not going to achieve everything, though. So we do need to be a little bit more intentional, and it's something we're thinking through at Cleantech Group as well. Part of the challenge with de-risking hardware and deep tech is that you do need demonstration projects. Very encouraging to hear the things that Julie said earlier on. De-risking that today often falls on the shoulders of the entrepreneur. We've got to finance it, typically with equity capital. It's just an untenable type of cost of capital for them to be able to shoulder. And with that, we can jump to the next slide. So a few of the things to watch. We covered the gap in financing on that last slide. The SPACs have been the hottest topic of the past year and a half or so. We're expecting these to continue diversifying beyond electric vehicles and batteries, and indeed we are seeing that. I believe the majority of SPAC vehicles on the market right now are still in the search mode, looking for their reverse merger target. So it is diversifying. You're starting to see things outside of the battery and EV space, starting to see more materials and chemicals, alternative fuels get financed that way. But with that diversity, we're going to start to see some of those valuations come back down to earth, which I think is potentially a welcome change for many people. We're starting to see that later stage hard tech financing trickle out a little bit. So organizations like World Fund, they actually have an emissions threshold that needs to be met for them to finance a company, very far from what's needed out in the ecosystem to accelerate those hardware technologies. But it is an initially encouraging sign. We can jump to the next slide. One of the things that's going to shift in corporate net zero is that up until today, there have been limited means for a corporation to actually ensure that during the peak hours, they are bringing energy in from renewable sources. Technology is being developed to resolve that. So more temporal, spatial tracing. This is going to allow companies in the future to be able to identify where energy came from at the minute they were using it and optimize their operations for decarbonization. So the underlying technology here is going to really shift a lot of the responsibility back to the corporations who have a true intention to reduce their emissions. We can go to the next slide. Distributed energy is becoming much more ubiquitous. We expect this to continue. But on top of that, more distributed energy resources can participate in markets. So you see a lot more aggregation happening as distributed energy continues to roll out to residential, commercial sites. The US FERC Order 2222, I think I got all the twos. This is going to open up the market to more aggregation, more participation from distributed energy resources. Corporates are scrambling to get a foothold there. So everything from oil and gas to energy retailers to utilities, there's been a wave of acquisitions. We expect this to continue to really own a piece of the network as more aggregation and participation starts to evolve. We can jump on to the next slide. I am a dad, so I can't get through a presentation without at least one pun. And mobility incumbents are going to see their innovation needs accelerate. Very similar logical construct to what we saw in the last slide. As EVs start to become more ubiquitous, as charging networks roll out, you see corporates needing to get that foothold to own the network. So we're seeing a lot of acquisitions in electric vehicle charging hardware, in some of the software platforms that enable these to be used as a service. And we're expecting corporations beyond OEMs to get involved. So ChargePoint obviously was an innovator just a few years ago, and now we consider an incumbent. Energy companies, again, oil and gas companies, there's a scramble to own these networks. We can jump to the next slide. And two very controversial topics here, nuclear fusion, hydrogen, very encouraging to hear Julie's remarks earlier. To truly achieve those 1.5 to 2 degree warming thresholds, it's not just a matter of reducing today's emissions. We've got to account for the precipitous increase in energy usage that the world is going to have in the coming decades. So we have to think beyond today's technology and think of what can help us achieve this long term. Nuclear fusion is one of the best paths. There's a joke that it's always 20 years away. I heard someone remark the other day that now it's only 18 years away. So seeing some of the financing going into these types of nuclear fusion technologies, we saw a landmark quarter in Q4 2021, $2.4 billion that was invested in just a handful of companies. So we are keeping our fingers crossed to see these develop a little bit more strongly in the next few years. Hydrogen, likewise, very controversial, but we are seeing a lot more investment going towards the hardware underlying hydrogen production and distribution. So this is really the infrastructure being built out, and the financing is at a commercialization level. So for those hard to abate sectors, steel, cement, long haul transport, this is all going to be critical. Hydrogen will be a critical player in decarbonization of these sectors. We can jump to the last slide. So thank you all very much for your time. I'm looking forward to your questions in the chat. Do reach out anytime at research@cleantech.com. Look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again.
Thanks, Anthony. Thank you for the pun, especially. We need more of that here at ITIF. It's something that we're working on internally, I have to say. And maybe being a dad is the key feature there. And thanks to all the presenters for an incredibly rich set of presentations. I'm going to be pondering them and going back and looking at the slides again, I'm sure, in the next week and as we think about our agenda here at ITIF. So we have a few minutes for conversation and discussion. And let me begin by bringing Julie back into the conversation. I was really pleased that Anthony mentioned a demonstration. This has been a big theme at ITIF. And now with the Build Back Better, with the infrastructure bill, the United States is going to make a big investment over the coming years. And as Anthony pointed out, these kinds of investments are really, really hard for private sector investors to stomach. So there has to be a public share, and that's been clear in all of the research. And now we're finally doing it. So I'm glad that Congress deserves credit and the administration for pushing that through. I wonder if you're able to reflect a little bit on international partnerships in the context of these demonstrations, whether it's foreign-owned firms, foreign headquartered firms. Obviously, many foreign-owned firms have big investments here in the U.S. and are clearly part of our innovation system. But I'm just curious whether you have thoughts on how the U.S. interacts, I guess more broadly with its competitors in these cutting-edge technologies, and how do we manage the federal investment in that regard?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm just reflecting on sort of both Nick and Anthony had really emphasized the importance of partnership, whether that's with our international partners or between the public and the private sector. And that's certainly something that we believe in or investing in here at the Department of Energy. Specific to demonstration projects, folks may be aware that with the new infrastructure resources that we received, DOE just stood up a new office for demonstration projects. And that office has $20 billion now that it's going to be investing. And I think, Anthony, to your point on the importance of us being able to help entrepreneurs de-risk, improve the commercial viability of some of these technologies, that really is going to be the focus of that office. And I had mentioned some of the energy earthshots. So again, hydrogen, carbon capture, and long duration storage. So demonstration projects in that area. But also, to your point on nuclear, we also see a lot of potential for small modular nuclear reactors as both things that are safe. They can be deployed in smaller communities and at smaller scale, obviously. And just given the gap in terms of where we need to go in terms of getting access to more clean power, are probably going to be a pretty critical part of the solution. The only other point that I would mention is I talked a little bit about the Clean Energy Ministerial Mission Innovation, and really seeing that as an important venue for how there can be a stronger partnership with other countries and with companies. In particular, what we've tried to do is, because the Energy Earthshots are sort of like a domestic program to try to drive more innovation, we also have missions in the, second iteration of Mission Innovation that are also focused on collaboration for those exact technologies, so that we're really bridging both our domestic efforts and investments with the international potential and trying to bring down the cost of those technologies, not only to strengthen U.S. domestic industries, which, Nick, I take your point that shouldn't be the only focus, right? But also making sure that we're really actively bringing down the cost of those technologies so that all communities and all countries have access to those technologies and can actually get them deployed.
Thanks. So I think we'll wrap up with sort of a lightning round. We are a policy shop here, and maybe I'll ask each of the speakers to highlight a particular policy. It doesn't have to be the only one. Nick laid out a wonderful framework for thinking about what policies should be doing. But if there's one that you would highlight for our audience that's underappreciated, needs to be strengthened, a critical pathway to getting to accelerating innovation, perhaps you could highlight that. So let me start with Hoyu, and then we'll just go around and wrap up with Julie. So Hoyu, what policy is your favorite for highlighting to this audience? You're on mute. Unmute.
Yeah, I've so many, but if I really have to pick one, I really want to stress the importance of collaboration, international collaboration, public-private sectors collaboration, and as well as between developed and underdeveloped countries collaboration. And this was the main message that I heard when tuning into a Glasgow, and this is something that I really want to see it materialized and realized and pushing forward.
Thanks. Nick, what would you highlight?
I won't highlight one, I'll highlight two, and the combination between those two. At OECD, in all my jobs, I've always been asked in the innovation space, when it comes to innovation policies, should we support direct support measures, grants, or should we, as an example, or should we support indirect measures, tax credits? And it's interesting because there's such heterogeneity in the use of the two instruments across countries, huge heterogeneity, with some relying almost exclusively on one and some almost exclusively on the other. And when they ask me that question, I can't answer them. It's a space where more work needs to be done to talk about the combination, the most effective combination of direct and indirect innovation related, and I would say specifically private R&D support measures that we need to think about. So I cheated, sorry.
Thanks. No, I think we have to be thinking about packages and not individual policies. And obviously that puts great pressure on us as analysts, because the more variables we have to control, the harder it gets. Anthony, especially kind of thinking about what would trigger the private sector outburst that you mentioned to continue. What can the public sector do to assist that?
Yeah, I'm going to continue with what Julia mentioned about demonstration. I do see that as having the potential to catalyze a lot of these hardware technologies. If you look at the success of the American-made prize for battery recycling, and you see some of these companies now, battery resourcers, Li-Cycle, they're going out raising funds, but now they're getting their physical facilities stood up, and they're starting to engage with corporates. So this became real very fast. I might also mention that, of course, this some type of demonstration support scheme is going to be critical for innovators. Isn't that positive for corporates too? Because they're going to be ultimately the ones who have to collaborate, probably procure this technology. We also find ourselves on the consulting side of the Cleantech group, where I used to sit, when we're talking with a corporate who's going through a lot of gyrations over what companies to fund and how to fund and balancing risk profile. We oftentimes find ourselves giving the advice, you should fund pilots before you fund companies, and especially before you put money into a fund. If you're dealing with something with a very tenuous risk profile, there's really going to be no better solution than getting hands-on and getting your hands dirty.
Great, thanks. And Julie, a last word on public policy?
Well, not substantially different, I think, from what folks here have said. I think just having a consistent, sustained environment for innovation. And so again, focusing on commercial viability. The other thing, though, is what we haven't really talked about is just investing in people, right? And so all of this is only possible if we have the next generation of scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs, if we're bringing more women into the workforce and into the energy sector, more minorities. And so we also need to make sure that as we're focusing on innovation, that we're also creating, like generating this new crop of people who are going to be the innovators of the future. So I would maybe just leave us on that note. And, you know, DOE is always hiring, so come on over.
Thanks. That's right. The portal opened today. I understand there's 1,000 jobs out there waiting
Yeah.
for people in the audience. Well, let me thank all the speakers. Thank the audience for joining us today. I hope you'll read Hoyu's report. You should follow the Cleantech group. You should follow IEA's statistical output. There's something new every day. I learned a lot from this presentation. And I hope we'll be able to get together in Pittsburgh, which is where the Clean Energy Ministry will be since September. Is that correct?
Correct.
So by then, perhaps all this badness will have passed and we can see each other in person. But until then, thanks again, and look forward to our next webinar down the road.